Cool. And on the sound, we'll see.
Lower part of my body.
Oh, I know. Yeah, like especially down here, just
What? Your brain. Yes, I am. When are you doing your class?
25th or 26th.
Oh, so I'll do before you. I remember, I think this is what are you doing? Let no, zero press. Let me see.
You will do it Monday, I will do it at Wednesday. So you are 25th of April and 27th.
Okay. So we still have it.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindley. I'm one of Dr. Ryland's TAs for the other section. So, do not know any of you, but nice to see you all. You all came to class on this rainy day, so that's awesome. Good job. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about voting and participation, kind of what that looks like in the United States, in our electoral system. So when you guys walked in, you heard a song by John Lennon written in the 60s. You know, kind of modern era, a lot of transition change, and kind of hint here, you all just got an email of the essay questions you're going to have for your test. And so the first one from that list comes from this song. So the song states, "Say you want a revolution, we better get on right away. We'll get on your feet and into the streets." So everyone, you know, take a minute to think. This might be an essay question you'll get in your test. What influence do you think revolution, protest, and voting has had on policy/decisions legislators have made? And do you think those decisions are reflective of our participation? So again, might be a question you all have on your exam. What influence do you think? So when I open, ask the class, what influence do you think revolution, protest, and voting has had on policy decision making? And do you think those protests are reflected in policy decisions, kind of policies that are made? What do you guys think? Anyone think of a protest that has happened in the past couple of years? Yeah. Capital rights, yes, kind of. Do you think kind of any policy change happened from that? Yeah, definitely. Other ones, anyone else think of protests, movements that have happened? Yeah. Yeah, definitely big movement around legalizing same-sex marriage for sure. So hopefully, you know, you guys think about this. Think of recent examples of when you've seen protests, walkouts, petitions, revolutions, and kind of start thinking, do you think the change, you know, people going to the streets, as they kind of say in the song, has been reflected in policy? All right, so by a raise of hands, who is at least 18, over the age of 18 here? Everyone, pretty much, yes. Now, who is registered to vote? Okay, I'll say about half. So just wanted to quickly show you guys how to register to vote. Very simple, depending on, you know, what state you're from. You can just simply Google register to vote. This is Oklahoma. The Texas page is very similar wherever you're from. And probably that first link that pops up, this is what you'll see. Very simple to do so. Put in all your information, and then you'll be given a voter ID, voter registration card. You can take to the polls. So, you know, as we'll get into here in a few minutes, voting is very important in the United States. Kind of our pipeline to government. So, you know, if you all can make a Instagram, TikTok page, we're very equally as capable of registering to vote. So let's. All right, so before we get into kind of importance of voting, what that looks like today, modern time, kind of important to start where we came from. What does voting look like in the Constitution? So prior to the 1870s, early 1700s, up until then, voting, only white men with property were given voting rights. However, with the 15th Amendment in 1870, following the Civil War, we had the passage of the 15th Amendment, which extended suffrage to African American men, so making all men eligible to vote. However, with that, you know, though the Constitution stated all men, there were still poll taxes placed on voting, so you had to pay to go vote. Literacy tests that people had to pass in order to go to the polls, and kind of other various forms of voting intimidation tactics still kind of limit who could vote. You know, that only wealthy men could not vote, and that poor, newly freed, uneducated slaves could not, or African American could not vote. So still really concentrating that power of white, wealthy men voting, so that would be reflected in who was elected. So then we get to 1919 with the women's suffrage movement. Prior to this, it was all men 21 and older. So then getting into the 19th Amendment in 1919 with the women's suffrage movement, women were then given the right to vote, however, still similar. With the 15th Amendment, there were literacy tests, poll taxes that were placed, that were enacted, again, to kind of limit poor women, again, uneducated Black women didn't have access to resources to education. So then, as we'll get into in a minute, 1965, we had the passage of the Voting Rights Act. However, but with the 26th Amendment, that changed the legal voting age from 21 to 18, kind of widened. If you're 18, you are considered a legal adult. So to really widen the number of people who could vote and kind of get more represented in government. So, kind of major voting rights acts. It was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law under the Johnson administration, kind of during the civil rights era, with all the protests that were going on during this time, really kind of lit a fire under government to make change. And with this, kind of as I said prior to the Voting Rights Act, voting laws, voting regulations were highly left up to the states. So the Voting Rights Act really kind of fundamentally changed. It's like the federalism that we have in the United States and kind of the power that the federal government has over voting and kind of the role they play in overseeing that. So then prior, from about 1919 to 1965, voting laws stayed the same with those literacy tests, poll taxes. But with the Voting Rights Act, this eliminated all those, got rid of poll taxes, literacy tests, other voting intimidation tactics. So no matter if you're Black, white, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, everyone could go vote. So how does voting actually work in the United States? So our voting system looks a lot different than other countries around the world. We're the only country that uses an electoral system. So we have a popular vote and electoral vote. So when you go to the polls, you cast what is called the popular vote, kind of telling your state how you want it to vote with the elector vote. So where we see that in the Constitution, so Article 2, Section 1, kind of lays out the rules, regulation guidelines of the Electoral College and how that will play out. So it's made up of 538 electors based on state population. So state like California, Texas, and Florida. Going to have a lot more electors than Oklahoma, Vermont, smaller states. Whoever, around election time, when you're watching the news, you'll hear the number 270 over and over and over again. Whichever candidate gets 270 elector votes first, winner takes all. So that is who will be the president. But this system can be a bit confusing to really understand kind of the difference in the popular vote when you go to the ballots and when the electors actually cast their vote. So I have a short video that I think explains it well, so you guys can see that visually how the Electoral College system works.
If you watch the news during a presidential election, you'll hear a lot of this.
What do the national polls look like?
Hillary Clinton's national. Joe Biden is currently ahead.
But these national polls don't actually tell you who's going to win.
Throw the national polls out the window. They don't matter at all. What matters are those swing states.
Ah, yes, the swing states. Most democracies around the world elect their head of state with a popular vote, so whoever gets the most votes wins. But in America, we do it a little differently. The US is the only country that picks its president using something called the Electoral College. It's made up of delegates from each US state. When Americans vote for president, what they're actually voting for is who their state will vote for. This is why every so often, someone wins the presidency without winning the popular vote. That's happened twice in just the past 20 years. The majority of Americans do not like the system and haven't for a long time. Both political parties have made attempts to get rid of it. So why does the US still use the Electoral College? And who actually benefits from it? The Electoral College is based on how people are represented in Congress, where each state has a number of representatives based on its population, and every state also gets 2 senators. So for example, let's look at Texas, which has a huge population, and Vermont, which has a really small one. Texas has 36 representatives in Congress. Vermont only gets 1. Representatives in both states each represent roughly the same number of people. In the Electoral College, a state gets the same number of delegates as their congressional representatives, plus 2 for each senator. So Texas has 38 electoral votes, Vermont has 3. But this combination makes the number of people each delegate represents way different between states. In Texas, 1 electoral delegate represents 3 times the amount of people as 1 in Vermont. And that makes each individual person's vote in Vermont a lot more influential. The Electoral College creates discrepancies like this all over the country. A voter in Wyoming is worth 3.5 times as much as a voter in California. And the winner of the presidential election is the candidate who gets 270 or more of these Electoral College votes. These are the results of the 2016 election by state. You're probably more familiar with this version of it, a map of red states and blue states. But this chart tells a different story. You can see that no state is actually all red or all blue, but almost every state awards its electoral votes the same way. The candidate who gets the most votes in a state gets all its electoral votes. If they win the state by 1%, they win 100% of the electoral votes. In 2016, more than 4 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. In fact, more people voted for him there than in any other state except for 2. But it didn't matter. Hillary Clinton got more votes there, so she got all 55 of its electoral votes. Clinton never even campaigned in California. Polling showed she'd easily win the state. Trump only visited Texas once. He knew he'd basically have that state's electoral votes locked. But they both visited Florida 35 or more times. That's because Florida is usually a swing state. Polls show that the vote there could swing to one party or another nearly every election. Trump only won it in 2016 by 100,000 votes, out of more than 9 million. Swing states have changed over time thanks to shifting demographics and political views. And it's states like these where presidential candidates spend most of their time campaigning. It also means these states have way more influence over the election than these ones. A study found that voters in Michigan had 51 times the amount of influence on the 2016 election as someone from a state like Utah. Voters in states like California or Missouri mattered very little. Swing states are where the election actually takes place. They get the attention and the influence, and they only exist because of the Electoral College. It doesn't seem very fair, but the Electoral College has always shifted power away from some people and towards others. It was how it was designed. Back when there were just a few states, not 50, they had to get all the states to agree on the Constitution. One problem. The northern states, which were largely anti-slavery, wanted only 3 people to count in the population towards electoral votes, which they had more of. The pro-slavery southern states were worried that they would be constantly outvoted and wanted enslaved people to count in determining the population. As a compromise, they settled on something called the 3/5 clause. It established that an enslaved person would only count as 3/5 of a person. In 1800, Pennsylvania, a northern state, and Virginia, a southern one, had about the same number of free people living there. But Virginia was also home to hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no freedom, let alone a vote, and ended up with more votes in the Electoral College than Pennsylvania. That year, those extra electoral votes gave the candidate from Virginia just enough to win. Even after the US finally abolished slavery and eventually gave Black Americans the right to vote, white Southern leaders found ways to keep them from voting, like with discriminating laws like poll taxes and acts of violence. This meant they continued to have overrepresentation in the Electoral College on behalf of a large population that couldn't vote. The first time Congress attempted to replace the Electoral College with a simple popular vote was back in 1816. But senators from southern states blocked it, saying it would be deeply injurious to them. In 1969, Congress came even closer. Replacing the Electoral College had support in both parties and even passed the House, but it was blocked again by southern senators. A senator from Alabama wrote, "The Electoral College is one of the South's few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it. Why change a system that historically had and still was benefiting white Southerners?" Today, this states that the Electoral College benefits have changed, but it's still making some voters more powerful than others. If we look at the states with a lot of electoral votes for not a lot of people, and the states with a little electoral votes for a lot of people, these states are a lot wider and less diverse than the rest of America. And many of these states are Republican strongholds. These tend to vote Democratic. That's one reason the two most recent Republican presidents have won the Electoral College without winning the popular vote. And since it's currently Democrats that are primarily disadvantaged by the Electoral College, they're the ones leading the charge to replace it with the popular vote.
Get rid of the Electoral College.
But as politics have changed, the people most critical of the Electoral College have too. In the 1948 presidential election, New York ended up being the major swing state. A congressman from Texas said, "I have no objection to the Negro in Harlem voting, but I do resent the fact that his vote is worth 100 times as much as the vote of a white man in Texas." Swing states change. What doesn't is that the Electoral College gives certain people more power to pick the president. And its biggest defenders have always been those who benefit the most from it.
All right. So from that, you kind of see better visual representation of kind of what the Electoral College looks like, how those 538 electoral votes are kind of dispersed based on population. There's been a lot of debate kind of, attendance. Attendance is live, so everyone, make yourself present. There's been lots of debate, kind of as I talked about at the end of the video. Should the Electoral College be abolished? Is it really representative of the United States kind of diverse population as a whole? So those really are kind of talks going on from a very old established system. Will it change? Will we no longer have the Electoral College in upcoming elections? We will see. All right. So why is voting important in the United States? Voting is kind of one of the greatest rights offered to us as American citizens. And it really is kind of that foundation of democratic principles that we live by, for the people, by the people. The only way for that to happen is going to the polls and voting on candidates you feel best represent you. This really is seen as a kind of a civic duty, your civic duty as an American citizen, to always go in all local, state, and federal elections to go vote on the candidate you want in office. With this, kind of give citizens a voice in democracy. Kind of really is our pipeline from us to government. Kind of what's going on in government. If you don't like what's going on, go to the polls, vote for a new candidate. If you do like what's going on, how things are being governed, go vote to keep that candidate in office. With this, really fosters democracy, kind of gets people talking during election times. That is the only thing you're going to see on the news. You're going to see it all over social media. And again, kind of really gets people talking about these issues, things they might have not thought about before, things they want to see change, things they want to see stay the same. And then gives us representation, again, that idea for the people, by the people. The only way to kind of really have this is if we vote on a candidate who we feel best represents us, our values, beliefs, issues we care about. And kind of that, again, voting is kind of that pipeline, who's in government, how they govern, why, things like that. So how do voters make their decisions? So again, by raising hand, who has voted in an election? Okay, of you guys who have voted, what were kind of things that led you to vote for the candidate you did and kind of make the decisions you did? What kind of led you to that? Yeah. COVID, okay. COVID policies kind of around there, okay. Other kind of issue areas, things you thought about when deciding which candidate you wanted to vote for? Yeah. Yeah, just know who they are for sure. Local elections definitely aren't covered as much, so just knowing the basics. Any other things that kind of led you to vote? What led you to vote on the candidate that you did? Yeah. Yep, definitely military rights. So you guys definitely hit on a couple, kind of so the main three factors that kind of guide people towards their voting. So first would be party loyalty. So whether you're a registered Democrat, Republican, whichever candidate is either the Democrat or Republican candidate, very likely that you'll stay loyal to your party and vote for them in office. The issues involved, kind of what is their campaign running on? What are they saying to make a priority? So, kind of example of how things could change. If there's someone who's a registered Republican, but kind of very passionate about climate change, environmental protections, and the Democratic candidate, much more where we see that. The Democratic candidate, kind of says, I'm going to prioritize climate change, environmental protections, kind of key I'm going to be running on, wanting to see make a difference, kind of maybe see the Republican candidates swayed to a Democratic party. And then characteristics of the candidate. Are they a strong leader? Do they have military background? A lot is important to a lot of people. Where they go to school? Are they educated? Kind of where are they from? North, south, northeast, or Midwest? Kind of where you grow up. Those factors really kind of play a factor into your beliefs, your values, and how you choose to govern. So all these three things are really kind of the main things that guide voters when going to the polls and which candidate they will cast a ballot for. However, though we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965 supplemental law, which gave everyone over the age of 18 the right to go vote, there's still, though we no longer have literacy tests, poll taxes, still there are kind of this idea that not everyone's voice is really being heard with our current voting system. So the power of resources, what you have access to, what access of resources you have access to matters. So, not everyone goes to college, takes American federal government class, and sees that you can just Google very simply how to register to vote. Not everyone has access to TVs, phones, social media, where they can educate themselves on the candidate. As someone said, back here, just knowing the names of people, not everyone has that. Or just the general knowledge of government, what that looks like, different issues that are going on. Just having those accesses to those resources, not everyone in the United States have. Things we might think of as just everyday, no big deal, really are a luxury for some people. So, and this idea that elite access of the educated class, business, and professionals are really kind of the only ones who have that access, knowledge to go to the polls, to go vote. And this kind of leads to fatalism among the less elite. So again, really the only people who are being able to cast their ballots are the educated, are the wealthy, whatever you call people who have college degrees. So really trying to find different ways, to have more people have access to those resources and going to the polls. So this kind of leads into why aren't voices being heard in government? Why aren't more people going to the polls? So kind of idea, talk about in political science known as the elitist theory versus the pluralist theory. So this applies to voting, but also thinking back to when we were talking about interest groups. Same idea, same principle kind of applies to what we were talking about there. So the elitist theory, why people won't go to the polls. Because government is really only run by wealthy, powerful, and not even necessarily our elected officials, but their constituents. People they turn to for policy-making decision is really only run by wealthy and the powerful, and there's really no access for common citizens, or the common citizen, middle and lower class citizens really aren't represented, and the policies that government makes really only is in favor for wealthy and kind of like benefit the wealthy. And then we have the pluralist theory, which is a bit more optimistic, but still the idea that government is run by these large think tanks, religious organizations, interest groups. Again, these are all very large organizations, corporations that focus on kind of a very narrow scope of issues and often funded by very wealthy, powerful people. And so that these groups, kind of idea that governments will be government policies will be kind of through collective action and bargaining, but again, only on a very narrow scope of issues that are really kind of only representative
I will say I
wealthy,
access
powerful
campus. I don't know
people.
if that will change.
So this kind of leads into the free rider problem.
Go to modules.
People think my vote doesn't matter, government's only run by the elite, only issues that are really talked about, if you will, are these ideas from these think tanks or religious organizations were funded by wealthy donors. So there's really no point for me to go to the polls, go vote, because my vote doesn't matter. I'll just kind of benefit, go off what everyone else does, and hopefully it works out best for me. But kind of an idea, kind of example to put this in perspective, as a political science student and public administration, I will always say your vote does matter. So, think on a good day, there's about 150, 200-ish people in this class. And then most of you are probably in 12 to 15 hours. So take all your 5 main lectures of 150 to 200 people. That's around 1,000 people.
Yeah,
1,000. The previous elections, some states, the difference from the Republican to the Democratic vote was only by a couple hundred, couple thousand. So think of everyone and your 5 classes said my vote didn't matter, but they did go to the polls. That would make a difference in those swing states, kind of as they were talking about. So always go to the polls, go vote, because your vote does matter. However, there still are some barriers to voting. Again, kind of going with this idea, not everyone feels represented in government when they go voting. So with just voter ID laws alone, this has been big talk today. I'm sure you guys are watching the news. Most recent election, we've heard a lot about voter ID laws. So people paying for the identification, the time associated with obtaining that ID, the cost associated with getting the documentation of the voter ID, and also transportation that might be required just to go get the ID. And that's just the voter ID alone, not actually going to the polls. So again, the time it takes to go vote, reduced hours, thinking even working professionals who might not be able to take time off from work, single moms who might not be able to leave home away from their children to go to the polls, and also the amount of time you have to actually go vote. Money, transportation, again, for some of us, having access to transportation might not seem like a luxury. For a lot of Americans across the United States, it is. So the amount of money it takes, buy a bus ticket, a taxi, a train, maybe up in the north, that it takes to get the money it takes to get to the polls. Location, again, kind of going back to access to resources. If you vote in an election, there's kind of very specific places you have to go to vote. Not everyone has access of knowing where those locations are, how to get there. Again, transportation of getting there might be far away from their home. They can't afford to get there, can't take time to get there. Language barriers. If you don't understand what is on your ballot, it's going to make it pretty difficult to make an educated decision. The weather, as we have said, for a lot of you, if you weren't required to be here, I'm sure you all would, but maybe you wouldn't. In Oklahoma, if there's a tornado, weather, people don't want to go out and do that. But definitely can be a barrier. And then lastly, some people who just cannot vote. If you're a convicted felon, you cannot vote in the United States. For some states, it's very narrow, not too harsh, but if you have mental handicap and kind of is seen, classified as incompetent, you cannot vote. And those who are residing in U.S. territories also cannot vote. So the access to voting has been widened with the Voting Rights Act. There still are barriers to get there that not everyone has access to, can have access to, can afford to do. Getting there, and then again, just with that voter ID alone, a lot of barriers there. So I have a poll for you guys. What do you see as the greatest threat to voting? So time associated with getting that voter ID, going to the polls, money, again, that was required to get the ID, that might be required for transportation, or time taken off from work, the money you lose from taking off work. Education, having access to education, being able to make informed decisions, knowing who the candidates are, knowing what issues they stand for, or location and transportation. So is that poll up and live? Okay. You guys, a few seconds answer that. All right. So though voting is the most known form of political participation, it goes well beyond voting. So just simply definition, activities of citizens that attempt to influence the structure of government, selection of government officials, or the policies of government. Again, political participation is really how our voice is heard in democracy, how legislators know what we as citizens want, and really the only way we have, kind of interaction from government to the people. So other forms of vote or other forms of participation beyond voting, protest, walkout. So recently, BLM protest movement, and then also 2 years ago in Oklahoma, there was teacher walkout, kind of advocating for better rights among K-12 and higher K-12 and higher ed teachers. Both definitely kind of had large influence over government, over new policies, making campaigns or making donations to campaigns and volunteering. So donating both at the local, state, and federal, more so if you guys wanted to get into that at the local and state level, maybe more so if you were up in DC to get on a presidential campaign, but definitely volunteering on those, having your efforts kind of help the campaign out, help that candidate get elected. Petitions, just talking about going back to 1919 with the women's suffrage movement, a lot of change that happened during that time was because of petitions that were signed. Now in the 21st century, if there's a petition you want to sign, good chances you're able to access that online. You can sign petitions. Writing to your representatives, you actually can write handwritten letters, emails to your representatives, explaining, I don't like what's going on, I like what's going on, let's do this differently. And they will read it. Lobbying, so kind of thinking back to interest groups, going to lobby for specific issues that kind of you're passionate about. Attending town hall meetings, so really at a local level, that really, more so at the local level, kind of what impacts your day-to-day lives. After town hall meetings, there will be times for, that they'll take questions, take comments from citizens where you kind of express your concerns. And then jury duty, also seen as a form of political participation. And again, kind of jury duty is a civic duty that they say where, you have kind of influence over local rules, regulations. And though a lot of people don't like it, jury duty will get you out of the day work. So if you get jury duty, do it once, done it once. So how do we cultivate participation, get more people active? First, knowledge and education. You all are college students at OU, so you already have a step above a lot of people. Making sure people have access to the resources of knowing what's going on in government, knowing who the candidates are, knowing what they stand for, just knowing the general process, governing process in the United States. Volunteering and service learning with youth groups, high school experiments, so really kind of getting younger generations involved in, not even necessarily political in nature, but kind of different service learning projects. So people can learn that by them going out, doing service learning projects, that they really do have the power to make change and kind of have influence over things. College programs, so things like OU, SGA, sort of government association, big event. SGA, obviously very political in nature, but the big event, again, getting college students out in their communities, making a difference, making change, and really seeing that they do have the power to do so. Again, then kind of translating that into politics by us going out, protest, voting, signing petitions. These things really do make a difference on legislators' decisions and outcomes. And then service projects, Army Corps, Peace Corps, and military services. With all this kind of a combination, getting younger generations, getting college students together, getting them out in their communities, doing different projects, and really, again, seeing that they have the power to do good, just kind of fosters this cycle of positive civic engagement. So, hopefully, when they're older, when you're all working after you graduate, they're going to have more of that real world experience, kind of taking that to the streets, if you want, kind of as the song states. Again, signing petitions, making educated voting decisions, so you really can play your part, as an American, your civic duty of going to vote and participating politically. So one more poll question for you guys. Which form of participation are you most likely to take part in? So voting in elections, political protest, writing to your representatives, or attending a town hall meeting. And with that, that is all I have for you guys. I hope you all go vote in the next elections and do your civic duty.
Right here, I think your thing is right? You have to pull all over. I know it's each other, but we have quiet, right? Or we laugh at each other, but we have quiet. Or you watch the video, you have your earbuds in, all that's rude, but at least you don't bother other people. Okay? So anywhere, this is really cool. You really have to try to do something like that. Really have to build things like that. Let's rock. You know? Okay, try to come here to happen. The rest of the morning, there's an election tomorrow. You run up for mayor and for city council seat. Our close election matters. So I sent you out a simple essay. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. This is a gift that I'm giving you. Right? So because I know you're not. Okay? So those of you that are then I'll take credit up for registering closed down on March 25th accidentally. Everything opened it, so we were looking for it just broken in there. Oh, we still have lives, right? It is closed for safety. Also, this is an opportunity to ask your fellows questions about the exams that you're taking. Not 4 days in advance, you prefer not to. All right, guys, be better. Over.